Robert Sterling sat on the porch of his New England seaside home, idling with a faded Zippo lighter in his hand. It was a trophy won on Tinian Island in 1945. The flame danced within the wind guard, emitting that familiar, nauseating, yet inescapable scent of kerosene. Even 40 years later, whenever he closed his eyes, that smell would instantly pull him back to the moment that changed the world. February 14th, 1942. Cambridge, Massachusetts. Outside the Converse Memorial Laboratory at Harvard University, a biting wind whipped remnants of snow against the red brick walls. It was the first Valentine's Day after America had officially entered the Second World War. Young couples across campus might have been exchanging chocolates or huddling together against the chill. But inside Professor Louis Fieser's laboratory, the air held no romantic fragrance, only the sharp tang of evaporating gasoline and a near-manic anxiety. Robert Sterling was just a graduate assistant to Professor Fieser then. He was 24, wearing thick-rimmed glasses, his fingers permanently stained with chemical reagents. "Rubber, Robert. It always comes back to rubber." Fieser paced restlessly before the lab bench, clutching an urgent telegram from the Army Chemical Warfare Service, CWS. This was one of the gravest challenges facing America in early 1942. As the Japanese army swept through Southeast Asia, crushing Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, 90% of the Allied forces' natural rubber supply had been severed. For the war machine, rubber didn't just mean tires. It meant the thickening agent for early incendiary weapons. In previous conflicts, the military used raw latex to gel gasoline, allowing it to adhere to targets while burning. But now, rubber was more precious than gold, and the U.S. military desperately needed a substitute. "We must find something that turns gasoline into jelly." Fieser stopped, his eyes fixing sharply on rows of failed mixtures lining the bench. "It has to stick to tanks, stick to bunkers, and even stick to—" He paused, leaving human skin unsaid. The atmosphere in the lab that afternoon was suffocating. Sterling was in charge of recording the precipitation rates of various formulas. They had tried countless mixtures of metal soaps and gasoline, aluminum stearate, rosin, even some bizarre polymers. Most were either too thin, running off like water, or too brittle, shattering upon impact. The turning point came around 3 p.m. Professor Fieser decided to try a new combination, an aluminum salt made from palmitic acid, extracted from coconut oil, and naphthenic acid, a byproduct of crude oil refining. Sterling watched as the professor carefully poured the brown powder into a beaker of gasoline. There was no violent chemical reaction, no explosion, only a quiet, physical transformation. "Stir it, Robert." Sterling picked up a glass rod and began to mix gently. At first, the powder merely suspended in the liquid, but as time passed, a strange phenomenon occurred. The gasoline began to cloud, the resistance against the rod increasing. Minutes later, when Sterling tried to lift the rod, the once volatile liquid trailed up like thick honey, or perhaps like a semi-solid jelly, forming a long, unbreakable strand. Professor Fieser leaned in, took a dab of the gel on his finger, and struck a match. Whoosh! A ball of orange-red flame instantly leaped up on the bench. It didn't flash burn and vanish like ordinary gasoline. It burned slowly, stubbornly. It clung to the glass rod, and no matter how hard Sterling shook it, the fire remained like a parasite, biting deep into its host until it was consumed. "Naphthenic and palmitic," Professor Fieser murmured, watching the dancing flame as if naming a newborn child. "Let's call it napalm." On that St. Valentine's afternoon, a Harvard professor presented the U.S. military with a dark gift. Sterling did not know then that this noun, born in a beaker, would become the most terrifying curse over the Pacific for the next 3 years. It required no scarce rubber. Its raw materials were cheap and inexhaustible, yet its burning efficiency was exponentially higher than any incendiary agent that came before it. At that moment, Stirling thought the flame was strikingly beautiful. He did not foresee how it would one day dye the night sky of Tokyo the color of blood. May 1943. Dugway Proving Ground, Utah. Robert Stirling was no longer a student in a white coat. He was a second lieutenant in the Army Chemical Warfare Service, clad in khaki. He had been sent to this desolate salt flat to assist in a top-secret test codenamed Dervish. As his jeep crested a dune, the sight before him made Stirling think he was hallucinating. Standing in the heart of the barren American desert was a collection of exquisite foreign architecture. These were not models, they were full-scale houses. To the left stood a row of typical German Berlin apartments, brick and stone, with thick walls. To the right stood a complex of completely wooden Japanese residences. "Welcome to Little Tokyo, Lieutenant Stirling," said the greeting engineering corps captain. Everything here was a meticulously designed death trap. To accurately test the lethality of napalm, the U.S. military had not cut corners. They hired the renowned architect Antonin Raymond, who had lived in Japan for 18 years, to ensure absolute authenticity. Stirling walked into one of the Japanese houses. The realism was spine-chilling. From the structural beams in the ceiling to the tatami mats on the floor, even the low tables and paper shoji screens were perfect replicas. "Where did this wood come from?" Stirling asked, touching a pillar. "It's Douglas fir. We've strictly controlled the moisture content to below 18% to simulate the dry state of Japanese wood after a humid summer," explained an accompanying engineer from Standard Oil, his tone as calm as if discussing furniture manufacturing. "As for the tatami, it's woven from sisal shipped from Hawaii. We've even simulated the overcrowded living conditions of Japanese families. The density of the furniture placement has all been calculated." This wasn't just architecture, it was the art of murder. On the day of the test, Stirling stood in a bunker miles away, binoculars in hand. A B-25 bomber swept low, dropping what looked like a mundane cylindrical object. It wasn't a traditional heavy bomb, but a cluster container for the M69 incendiary. In midair, the container opened, and dozens of pipe-like M69 submunitions scattered. They trailed long cloth streamers to maintain a vertical drop. Stirling watched as the pipes smashed through the fragile roofs of Little Tokyo, a few seconds of dead silence. Then it was as if a light had been switched on inside the exquisite wooden house. The windows turned orange-red. The M69s were filled with the very napalm Professor Fieser had invented. A delay fuse ensured they ignited only after penetrating the roof and landing inside. The napalm sprayed like a fountain, coating walls, tatami, and furniture. The fire didn't just swallow everything instantly. It spread with a life of its own. Stirling watched the house transform into a massive torch within minutes. More terrifyingly, due to the intense heat and stickiness of the napalm, adjacent houses began to smoke. Tongues of fire licked at the dry timber, and aided by the wind, the entire neighborhood was engulfed in a sea of fire. In this desolate proving ground, the Americans were testing not just a bomb, but a new philosophy of war. Inside the bunker, Stirling heard officers discussing the data. Burning temperature exceeds 1,000 degrees Celsius, cannot be extinguished with water, not only destroys the structure, but consumes the surrounding oxygen, causing asphyxiation. Stirling wrote in his notebook, "Test successful. M69 has a devastating effect on wooden structures. Recommendation, mass production." He closed the notebook, his palms sweating. He realized this weapon was not designed to strike military fortresses or tank factories. It had only one target: cities and the people living within them. Early 1944. While M69 incendiary bombs began mass production in factories back home, on the other side of the world, air warfare was taking on a very different face. Sterling read descriptions of the European theater in intelligence briefings. That was the domain of the U.S. Army Air Force's USAAF 8th Air Force. Over Berlin, Hamburg, and the Ruhr, the war, however brutal, still adhered to the lingering echoes of a classical chivalry, at least in the eyes of the pilots. It was the golden age of the P-51 Mustang. Sterling had met a rotation pilot from the 8th Air Force in a London pub once. The young man had spoken with animated gestures about dogfighting Luftwaffe Bf-109s and FW-190s at 30,000 feet. "It's a hunt, Sterling," the pilot had mimed, flying with his hands. "We escort the B-17s, using the Norden bomb sight to drop pickles right down Hitler's chimney. We want precision, pinpoint removal." The logic of the European theater was to destroy the Axis industrial heart, ball-bearing plants, synthetic oil refineries, rail hubs. It was the dogma of high altitude, daylight, precision bombing. Though casualties were heavy, the USAAF commanders believed that if they bombed accurately enough, they could paralyze the Nazi war machine. However, when Sterling turned his gaze to the Pacific, he found that the European experience was utterly useless there. In June 1944, U.S. forces launched the Mariana Islands campaign. Sterling landed on the newly captured islands of Saipan and Tinian with the first logistics assessment team. The air was suffocatingly hot and humid, smelling of rotting vegetation and corpses. Here, there were no concentrated industrial zones like in Europe. Japan's factories were scattered among thousands of family workshops in Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya. A family might machine aircraft parts in their backyard and assemble radio coils in their living room. This shadow industry drove the American generals, who worshipped precision bombing, to despair. You couldn't use expensive precision-guided bombs to destroy every wooden shack. Worse still, the Pacific skies held the notorious jet stream. In a makeshift command post on Tinian, Sterling witnessed the early reports coming back from B-29s flying out of Chengdu, China. Those massive super fortresses encountered winds of 200 to 300 kilometers per hour at 30,000 feet. The Norden bomb sight was useless in such conditions. Bombs were blown miles off target. "We are dropping priceless bombs into the ocean to feed the fish," an Air Force colonel shouted, slamming a report onto the desk. This was not just a technical failure, it was a strategic dead end. Tensions between the Army Air Forces and the Navy reached a fever pitch. Admiral Nimitz's fleet was slowly strangling Japan. Believing a naval blockade was sufficient, the Army Air Forces desperately needed to prove that their expensive B-29s could win the war independently. It was amidst this strategic anxiety that the Harvard gift Sterling brought was re-examined. One night, in the temporary camp on Tinian, Sterling watched the Seabees bulldozers flattening coral reefs in the distance. They were building the largest airfield in the world. Hundreds of trucks shuttled back and forth, searchlights turning night into day. "What are you looking at, Lieutenant?" a voice asked from behind. Sterling turned to see an officer with gloomy eyes, chewing on a cigar. It was a staff officer under General Curtis LeMay. "I'm looking at the runways, sir," Sterling replied. "They're incredibly long. That's so the B-29s can take off with a full load." The officer blew a smoke ring, a cold glint in his eyes. "High-altitude precision bombing isn't working. Some people in Washington are losing patience. We need to change the game." The officer pointed toward the docks, where Navy transport ships were unloading crates marked with yellow labels. "Are those your toys? The things called M69? "Yes, sir. Napalm. The Navy shipped them in. Rare cooperation between Army and Navy," the officer sneered. "Hope they're more useful than they look, because if this doesn't work, We'll have to fight for every inch of that damn island on the ground. Sterling looked at the mountains of ammunition crates. He knew what was inside. Not ordinary explosives, but millions of gallons of solidified death. A new strategy was brewing. No longer the gentlemanly duel of the European theater. No longer the precise surgery seeking factory chimneys. In the Pacific, war was about to return to its most primal, savage form: fire. The Army Air Forces would provide the vehicle, B-29. The Navy would provide transport and escort, and the Chemical Warfare Service would provide the ammunition. These three forces converged on Tinian, poised to unleash a catastrophe unprecedented in human history upon the Japanese archipelago. Sterling felt a chill. Despite the tropical heat, he felt as though he were back in that cold Harvard lab. The ghost born on Valentine's Day had finally crossed the ocean to find its ultimate destination. "Get ready, Sterling." The officer patted his shoulder and turned to leave. "Soon, we're going to bring hell to earth." November 1944, Northfield, Tinian Island. Robert Sterling stood by the runway paved with crushed coral. The dust here was eternally white, coating the Jeep's windshield like bone ash. The air was a mix of the sharp tang of aviation fuel and the rotting humidity of the tropical jungle. Overhead, massive B-29 superfortresses were landing. These silver beasts were the most advanced aircraft in the world, boasting pressurized cabins, remote-controlled turrets, and massive payloads. Yet, as they taxied to the hard stands, Sterling saw only exhaustion and despair on the pilots' faces. "The damn Westerlies!" A captain from the 73rd Bombardment Wing slammed his flight cap onto the ground after hopping out. "It's impossible to fight." This was the awkward adolescence of the B-29 in the Marianas. The commander at the time was Brigadier General Haywood Hansell, a staunch believer in high-altitude precision bombing. He insisted that B-29s fly at 30,000 feet, using the advanced Norden bomb sight to surgically destroy Japanese aircraft plants. But Hansell ignored an invisible enemy: nature. In the briefing room, Sterling listened to the weather officer explain. At 30,000 feet over Japan, there was a ferocious jet stream with wind speeds reaching 200 miles per hour. "It's like threading a needle in a hurricane," the officer pointed to the isobars on the map. "Flying downwind, the ground speed is too high for the bomb sight to calculate. Flying upwind, the plane practically hovers, becoming a sitting duck for flak. And once the bombs drop, the wind blows them miles off course." The results were disastrous. Missions against the Nakajima Aircraft Company failed time and again. Thousands of tons of high explosives were dropped into the Pacific or exploded in farmlands miles from the factories. Sterling watched all this with mixed emotions. He remembered the burning Japanese village in the Utah desert. He knew the warehouses were stacked with tens of thousands of M69 napalm bombs, Professor Fieser's life's work, the key designed specifically for Japanese cities. But General Hansell refused to use them. "We are not barbarians," Hansell reportedly said in a staff meeting. "Our targets are industrial facilities, not civilians' wooden houses. I will not turn the Air Force into arsonists." It was a chivalry belonging to a bygone era, but in the brutal logic of total war, it was pale and powerless. Washington's patience was running out. General Hap Arnold needed results. He needed Japan's surrender, not noble failure. Sterling knew change was coming. He checked the neglected incendiary bombs at the docks daily, ensuring they hadn't succumbed to moisture. He was waiting for someone willing to open Pandora's box. January 1945. Change arrived bluntly. A C-54 transport plane landed in Guam, and out stepped a major general with a grim face and a cigar permanently clamped in the corner of his mouth. Curtis LeMay. He replaced Hansell as commander of the 21st Bomber Command. If Hansel was an idealistic aristocrat, LeMay was a ruthless executor. He didn't care about morality or tradition. He cared about one word: efficiency. Sterling first met LeMay in the ammunition depot on Tinian. LeMay didn't sit in an air-conditioned room reading reports. He went straight to the logistical front line. "Is this the glue that Harvard professor cooked up?" LeMay pointed to an open crate of M69s. "Yes, General. Napalm." Sterling stood at attention. "Its burning efficiency is 5 times that of standard incendiaries. Extremely high adhesion." LeMay picked up a 6-pound M69 submunition, weighing it in his hand. It looked unremarkable, just a gray hexagonal steel pipe, but he seemed to see a different future through that steel. Hansel played with his microscope at 30,000 feet and hit nothing. LeMay tossed the bomb back into the crate with a loud clang. "If there's wind up high, we go low. If there are clouds by day, we attack by night." Sterling looked at the general in astonishment. The B-29 was designed as a high-altitude bomber. Flying low meant forfeiting its advantage and exposing the massive airframe to Japanese anti-aircraft fire. "But General, low altitude, even at 5,000 feet, our loss rates will—" "The Japanese have no night fighters," LeMay interrupted, his voice cold as ice. "Their flak radar is garbage. As long as we fly low, we don't fight that damn jet stream. As long as we go at night, we don't worry about Zero fighters." LeMay turned, locking his eyes on Sterling. "I want you to prepare enough of this stuff. Not a few hundred tons, thousands. I want to sprinkle them like rain." In the following weeks, the bases across the Marianas underwent a radical upheaval. LeMay issued an order that chilled every pilot to the bone. Remove all defensive guns and turrets from the B-29s, except the tail gun, and even strip the armor plating. "To carry more bombs," LeMay explained, "every pound of machine gun and ammo weight gets swapped for napalm." The pilots were terrified. They felt they were being sent on suicide missions. It was like asking a heavy knight to strip off his armor and charge into enemy lines with a torch. But in LeMay's calculus, it was simple math. Without the guns, a B-29 carried 3 tons of bombs. Stripped, the payload skyrocketed to 6 or even 8 tons. For victory, he was willing to gamble the lives of thousands of crewmen, and more so to bury hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians. Although the Army Air Forces devised the strategy, it was the U.S. Navy that delivered the fires of hell to the center of the Pacific. The Pacific War was a logistical nightmare. Every gallon of gas, every screw, every ounce of napalm had to cross thousands of kilometers of ocean. February 1945. The port of Tinian was as busy as post-war New York. Sterling was assigned to coordinate ammo unloading. Here, he witnessed the era's greatest industrial miracle, the joint operational capability of the U.S. military. Liberty ship after Liberty ship docked. Cranes shrieked as they hoisted massive wooden crates from the holds. "Hey, Army!" a Navy quartermaster shouted, holding a manifest. "Here are your Tokyo bed warmers, 3rd batch, 2,000 tons straight." Sterling looked at the mountain of crates stamped with the code E-46 cluster bomb. Each E-46 cluster contained 38 M69 submunitions. When dropped, the cluster would open in mid-air, covering a vast area like shotgun pellets. The Navy risked their necks for this. The quartermaster wiped sweat from his brow. Submarine threat isn't gone yet. Carrying these flammables, if one torpedo hit us, the whole ship would blow like a giant Zippo at sea. Sterling watched the sailors, shirtless and bronzed by the sun. The Army Air Forces dropped the bombs from the sky, but without the Navy's desperate escorts on the sea, LeMay's B-29s were just expensive transport planes. This inter-service cooperation wasn't always smooth. The Navy had mocked the Army's high-altitude precision bombing as a waste of resources, and Admiral Nimitz preferred starving Japan with naval mines. But with the brutality of Iwo Jima and the looming invasion of Okinawa, Everyone realized they had to destroy Japan's war potential quickly, or the invasion of the home islands, Operation Downfall, would cost millions of casualties. Napalm became the final solution of their compromise. The Navy brought the fire, the Army lit it. That night, Sterling spot-checked an M69 in the warehouse. He unscrewed the safety cap and smelled it. Palmitic and naphthenic acid mixed with gasoline. In the Harvard lab, it was a scientific discovery. In the Tinian warehouse, it was the prelude to a nightmare for millions. He looked at the gray steel pipe in his hand, trailing its long cotton streamers. These stabilized the fall, ensuring it would punch headfirst through the tiled roofs of Japanese homes. "It is a perfect industrial product," Sterling muttered. "Cheap, efficient, lethal." March 8, 1945. The decisive moment arrived. In the briefing room of the 313th Bombardment Wing, the tension was palpable. Hundreds of B-29 pilots and navigators sat on folding chairs, waiting for the mission brief. LeMay had already conducted small-scale incendiary probes on Kobe and Nagoya. The results were encouraging, but not devastating. Now, he felt the time was right. The curtain was pulled back, revealing a massive map of Tokyo. "Gentlemen," the operations officer's voice trembled slightly. "Tomorrow night's target is the Shitamachi district." The area circled in red was the most densely populated part of Tokyo. It held not only tens of thousands of wooden homes, but also countless shadow factories. "We will not fly in high-altitude formation," the officer continued, sparking immediate commotion. "You will go in singly. Altitude." He paused, gathering courage. 5,000 to 7,000 feet. "Good God, that's suicide!" someone shouted. "We'll be shot down like ducks." "You won't," the officer raised his voice. "Intelligence shows Japanese night defenses are practically zero, and here's the key: no high explosives. You will carry entirely M69 incendiaries. This is a maximum payload mission." Sterling stood in the corner, watching the faces of these young men. Fear, anger, but mostly a soldier's obedience. They knew this order came from the man they privately called Iron Ass. After the briefing, Sterling walked out into the sultry air. On the runway, ground crews were fueling and loading the B-29s. It was a sight never before seen in human history. 334 B-29 bombers lined up like beasts waiting to feed. Sterling approached a bomber named the Lucky Irishman. The bomb bay doors were gaping open, mechanics winching bundles of 46 clusters into the belly. Each bundle looked like a coffin containing dozens of reapers. "How much is she carrying?" Sterling asked the master sergeant. 6 tons, sir. All napalm." The sergeant patted the fuselage. "The load on this one plane can burn an area the size of 2 football fields. And tonight, we have over 300 of them." Sterling calculated quickly. 334 planes, 6 to 7 tons each. That was nearly 2,000 tons of napalm. 2,000 tons. In the Harvard lab, a few grams had burned through a workbench. 2,000 tons was enough to turn any city on Earth into purgatory. The afternoon of March 9th, the sun began to dip. The roar of engines was deafening. The entire island of Tinian trembled. The first B-29 began its roll. Heavy with bombs, it taxied for an eternity, barely lifting its nose at the very end, wings skimming the ocean spray. Sterling stood on the control tower, watching plane after plane claw into the sky, disappearing into the northern twilight. They formed a train hundreds of miles long, a death march manufactured by industrial assembly lines. "It begins, Sterling." General LeMay, standing beside him, lowered his binoculars. His face was expressionless, save for the cigar flickering at the corner of his mouth. "Before this night is over, we'll either be court-martialed or we'll end this war." The Pacific wind blew salt across the tower. 1,500 miles away in Tokyo, millions of civilians had just finished dinner, preparing for sleep. They did not know the sky was bringing not peace, but a storm unlike any other. There was no flash of atomic fission, no sci-fi death ray. Only the most primal element, fire. Calculated, chemically formulated, industrially mass-produced fire. March 10th, 1945, 0008 a.m. In the Tinian war room, radio silence weighed on everyone like a heavy lead plate. Robert Sterling clutched a cup of cold coffee, his eyes glued to the clock on the wall. 7 hours had passed since the first B-29 took off. By calculation, they should have reached Tokyo. "Signal received," a communications officer shouted, shattering the suffocating silence. "It's the Pathfinders." Before the main force arrived, a few elite B-29s had gone ahead. Their mission wasn't to bomb, but to light the stage. In the pitch-black sky over Tokyo, these lead planes didn't drop napalm, but M47 incendiaries. These bombs created intense white phosphorus fires upon impact. Within seconds, 4 massive lines of fire were ignited in the darkness of the Shitamachi district, crossing on the ground to form a gigantic burning X. It was the coordinate of death. Following close behind was Curtis LeMay's main armada. Over 300 B-29 bombers swarmed into the X-marked zone like locusts. Sterling wasn't in the air, but through the broken static of the pilot chatter, he could reconstruct the hellish scene in his mind. "This is Georgia Peach, altitude 5,500. Good God, the thermals are too strong. Bombs away, dump everything. Look down there. The whole ground is moving. It looks like lava." On the ground in Tokyo, the M69 napalm bombs began to reveal their true horror. As the cluster bombs burst in midair, tens of thousands of hexagonal steel pipes rained down like hail. They punched through fragile tiles and wood, landing in tatami rooms, backyard workshops, and crowded streets. Then, the delay fuses triggered. Not an explosion, but a spray. Every M69 spewed a tongue of flaming napalm dozens of meters long. The sticky gel instantly adhered to everything: wood, paper, fabric, and human bodies. If it had been an ordinary fire, Tokyo's fire brigades might have coped. But this was a saturation attack, meticulously calculated by Harvard scientists. Thousands of incendiaries fell per square mile. The ignition points were too dense to fight. More terrifying was the wind. A strong seasonal wind was blowing across Tokyo. Thousands of initially separate fires were whipped together by the wind, merging into one. The intense heat caused air to rise violently, sucking in cold air from the surroundings to fill the vacuum, creating a terrifying firestorm. This superheated convection generated hurricane-force winds that drove the fire sideways. The flames didn't just burn up, they surged through the streets like a flood. The immense suction even pulled fleeing people into the inferno like dry leaves. On Tinian, General LeMay watched the red zone on the map expand, a look of cold satisfaction on his face. "It seems the Harvard professor didn't lie to us," LeMay said icily. "It really does turn wood into charcoal." Sterling looked at the map, feeling a wave of nausea. He knew what that red circle represented. It wasn't just family workshops making airplane parts. It was a district with a population density of over 100,000 per square mile. It was women, the elderly, and children. In that moment, science lost its innocence and became a full accomplice to slaughter. Dawn, March 10th. The bomber fleet began to return. Sterling waited early at the end of the runway. As the first B-29 descended through the morning mist, he noticed something abnormal. These silver birds had left gleaming, but they returned with their bellies and undersides smoked black. That wasn't engine exhaust. It was soot from the ground in Tokyo. When the ground crew opened the bomb bay doors for inspection, a sickening odor instantly permeated the air. Jesus, what is that smell? A young mechanic covered his nose. Sterling smelled it. It was a mix of charred wood, sulfur, and something he tried desperately to scrub from his memory. The smell of roast meat. A captain named Jim stepped off the plane. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, as if he had just returned from the underworld. He didn't celebrate victory as usual. Instead, he slumped against a Jeep tire, his hands shaking so badly he couldn't light his cigarette. "Lieutenant Sterling," Jim's voice was hoarse. You could smell it even at 5,000 feet. The smell of burning flesh. Jim took a drag, continuing. The thermals were terrifying. Our plane was tossed around like a rowboat in a storm. That was the heat wave from the ground. I swear, I saw the co-pilot's window smoked over. We were above the clouds, but the red glow from below lit them up. It was like flying over a sea of blood. Later that day, reconnaissance planes brought back panoramic photos. Before this moment, everyone had only imagined the scale of destruction. But the photos presented a cold reality. In the center of Tokyo, a massive, ashen white scar had appeared. Approximately 16 square miles, about 41 square kilometers, had been wiped flat. Within this perimeter, apart from the shells of a few sturdy concrete buildings like schools or theaters, everything, tens of thousands of houses, bridges, streets, had been reduced to ash. Intelligence began estimating the casualties, first thousands, then tens of thousands. Finally, the numbers settled in an unbelievable range. In a single night, at least 80,000 to 100,000 people died, and over 1 million were left homeless. The death toll exceeded the immediate fatalities of the later atomic bombings of Hiroshima or Nagasaki. LeMay looked at the photos without mercy. This is just the start, he told his staff. If they don't surrender, we burn the next city, until the list is finished. Sterling stared at the photo of the Tokyo ruins, desolate as the surface of the moon, and realized the war had mutated. There was no longer a distinction between the front line and the rear, no boundary between soldiers and civilians. This was industrialized extinction, the physical erasure of a centuries-old city in 6 hours through chemical equations and assembly line operations. The flame born in a test tube on Valentine's Day had grown into a beast devouring civilization. The Great Tokyo Air Raid was only the prologue. For the next 5 months, Sterling watched as this destruction became routine. American tactics were quickly standardized. B-29s entered at low altitude by night, dropped M69 napalm, created a firestorm, and returned. It became a dry spreadsheet. Nagoya, the aircraft hub, burned. Osaka, the commercial center, burned. Kobe, the major port, burned. LeMay even drew up a target list of 64 Japanese cities. No longer just metropolises, medium-sized cities like Toyama and Shizuoka were doomed. Toyama, being primarily wooden, was 99.5% incinerated in a single raid. Meanwhile, on the other side of the globe, the European war was winding down. In those skies, P-51 Mustangs were still fighting the last nightly duels against Luftwaffe Me-262 jets. Fighter against fighter, pilot against pilot. In the Pacific, Japan's air defenses had collapsed. Their night fighters were scarce, their fuel exhausted. The B-29s poured napalm according to a timetable, almost undisturbed. Sterling saw in logistics reports that domestic U.S. napalm factories were struggling to keep up with the consumption. Standard Oil had to open new production lines. This was the pinnacle of cooperation between the U.S. Army Air Forces and the U.S. Navy. The Navy's submarines and mining operations, Operation Starvation, severed Japan's raw material transport and blockaded all ports. The Air Force destroyed the production capacity on the ground. The Japanese war machine was drained of blood, oil, and then had its bones, factories, burned. By June 1945, the absurd problem facing the U.S. military was, "We're running out of cities to burn." Sterling once saw a note on a memo, "Recommend sparing Kyoto, cultural heritage. Others, proceed as planned." Under this systematic destruction, Japanese civilians were driven to desperation. They were survivors of the burning night. Millions fled the cities for the mountains. Japan's industrial capacity effectively hit zero. This is why, when the atomic bomb finally fell in August, many historians later argued it was merely the last nail in the coffin. Napalm had already built the coffin. September 1945, the third week after the war ended. Robert Sterling sat in a Willys Jeep driving into Tokyo. He was there as a member of the first technical assessment team of the occupation forces. Despite having seen countless reconnaissance photos, the shock of physically being in the ruins left him breathless. The sound of tires crunching over rubble echoed through the empty streets. It was too quiet, terrifyingly quiet. The once bustling Shitamachi district now offered a view clear to the horizon. No wood remained. The fire had burned so cleanly that only stone foundations, twisted iron bed frames, safes, and unrecognizable ceramic shards were left. Sterling stopped the car by the Sumida River. Survivors said that on the night of March 10th, thousands had jumped into the river to escape the fire, but the heat had boiled the water. He wrote in his notebook, "Effect of M69 incendiary. Exceeded all expectations. It performed its design task perfectly." Back in the Jeep, Sterling started the engine. Behind him, the setting sun dyed the ruins of Tokyo a blood red, just like that night that changed everything.